Hi guys, this is the Unlucky AngelStar. As you can see, I don't have my new model yet ready for review content. Once when I do get my model and do my debut, hopefully before March, I'll be sure to make an update video on what's going to the channel. And of course, I'll be using it for my Klonoa review retrospective. But in order to appease the YouTube algorithm, which you can help by doing the following. And of course, talk about the thing I've been talking a lot about this year, video games. To be more specific, I want to talk about video games that are weird, obscure, and only have one title in their series, which I happen to call weird and obscure one-off games. So here's how this video works. I'm going to be looking at a handful of games that only had one title in their series, and I'll rate them on a scale of 1 to 5, in my opinion, on how weird or obscure they are. So I'm only looking at one-off games, meaning that they only had one title in their series. But I'll make some exceptions, such as them appearing in spin-offs or crossover games, as well as potential sequels that may come out within a year or two, so that way this video doesn't feel so outdated. So let's start off with the first not-so-obscure title on this list, Mischief Makers. Mischief Makers was released back in 1997 on the Nintendo 64 and developed by Treasure and published by the Enix of Square Enix. Mischief Makers is about a cyborg named Marina Lightyear who is on a mission to save her pervy inventor from the evils of the Empire. What gives Mischief Makers a bit of the weird factor? It's a 2D platformer on a console that specializes in 3D platformers. So of course you have to get to a specific point of the level just to beat it. Also weirdly enough, you use the D-pad of all things to move around, and double tapping in a specific direction will give you a boost. B button lets you pick up or even throw characters depending on the direction you throw them in, and pressing down on the D-pad makes you shake, which is the most common thing you can do in this series. Now, I should also explain this when talking about these video games. I did not play all these games from beginning to end. Luckily, I think that's a good thing, because if I was judging Mischief Makers on the first few minutes, I didn't think it was that good. Which is a big deal considering a lot of people consider this a hidden gem on the N64. But then again, I only made it to the quote-unquote park level, and the game froze immediately. I should also mention the design of the game, well, it's borderline freaky. But if I was given more time to look at the game, I would say there is hidden gem material. The designs of the levels and characters definitely make this a pretty weird title in itself, but many of other channels have talked about this game in high regard that I can't really call it obscure. So for the weirdness level, I'm going to give it a 5, and obscure level, I'm going to give it a 1. Now that you get a good idea of what kind of games we're going to be talking about, I'll only find something a little more obscure, and surprisingly, the year 2012 has also a pretty obscure game, and it's on the Xbox 360. I actually got this from my family, as they no longer play it anymore, as well as a few Xbox 360 games. So if there's a title you want me to talk about in the future, leave it down in the comments. But for now, I want to talk about Lollipop Chainsaw. Released in 2012, published by Warner Bros. Interactive Entertainment, and also published by Kadokawa Shoten in Japan, aka Kadokawa, but the developer might be something pretty interesting. The developer was Grasshopper Manufacture, the studio by Suda51, the guy behind the No More Heroes series. I'll be generally honest, I've never played the No More Heroes games, and you kind of say this is my first time playing a game of his. And luckily when it comes to weird, Suda51 is kind of the king. And Lollipop Chainsaw is probably the best example of this, as you play a high school cheerleader, Juliet Starling. And today is her 18th birthday, and on her birthday, her hometown is under a massive zombie outbreak. And luckily enough, Juliet comes from a family of zombie hunters. But not only that, her boyfriend Nick gets ahead of the action as well. And I mean that quite literally, because he's only ahead now. I told you this game would get weird. From what I can tell from Suda51's previous works like Killer 7 and the No More Heroes series, apparently he specializes in hack-and-slash 3D beat-em-ups, and you tend to do that with hordes of zombies. I wouldn't really call that an obscure thing, as there were a lot of video games that had a zombie mode. I wouldn't be surprised if Nintendo eventually did something like that. But I actually really like the combat system in this game, even though I keep forgetting which buttons do what. But the basic idea is that you can do light-based attacks with the X button with the pom-poms, and do heavy-based chainsaw attacks with the Y and A button. Here's an interesting trick that it makes me remind me of which button does what. The Y button on the Xbox controller is on the top, so you use that for literally chopping heads, and the A button's on the bottom, so you use that for chopping the legs. And the B button is for dodging. You also get a super meter which allows you to insta-kill zombies, which is really fun, and you can unlock more combos and even some really interesting cosmetics. And I'll admit, I actually had a lot of fun with this game. Though I will say there are dedicated fans to Suda51's work that I don't think I would call this obscure, but I bet you a lot of people don't know that there's talk of a remaster coming out later this year, and a potential sequel, but I didn't know about that until later on, which should technically kick this off the list, but considering that's not coming out until potentially 2023, and you don't know whether or not internet rumors are true or not, take it with a pinch of salt. The game is still pretty weird, as you are playing a cheerleader with a chainsaw slashing zombies with the head of your boyfriend on your ass. But considering that the 2010s was full of zombie-based horde battles, it didn't really stand up towards the crowd. So for the weirdness level, I'll give it a 3, and obscurity, also a 3. It's a pretty basic game, but it's highly worth playing. So if there is going to be a remaster, I highly recommend getting it. These last two games, I will generally admit, are not really what you'd call obscure. Weird, definitely, but when it comes to some really obscure titles, there's no better place to look than the PlayStation 2. And with a title I actually found called Hurdy-Gurdy. Released in 2002 and developed by Core Design and published by Eidos Interactive. I was genuinely surprised to find this one, and you'd think with a cover like this it'd be somewhat scary, but that is far from the truth. It's somewhat similar to the situation like what they do with Kirby in my general opinion. The plot of Hurdy-Gurdy is, well, it's about a boy named Gertie, and by the way that's a terrible name for a child, who tries to wake his father in time for the big herding tournament, but a curse has been put on him by a man named Sadorf. So Gertie enters the competition in his place in order to break the curse. And the idea of this game is all about herding. It's actually under the genre of strategy puzzle game, as you try to herd different types of animals into their pens, and there are a variety of animals in the game. I actually really love the names though, they're silly. Like these little dumb chickens called dupes, pink bears called gromps, and these weird Ewok looking creatures called bleeps. There are probably other types of species, but again, didn't do a whole playthrough. Probably the biggest reason why? The game runs pretty poorly. As when you start the game, there's a loading screen that takes you to another loading screen, which takes you to the main menu to another loading screen, and when you enter a new area, there's another loading screen. Yeah, that's kind of the biggest problem I have with this game. That and also sometimes runs like ass. But for a strategy puzzle game, it does give you some interesting ideas and gadgets on how to handle certain situations. So another really interesting problem I ran into was there was this strange animal I have never seen get eaten before, and later I run into the tutorial character Molly, who seems like a Bottles reject if you ask me, who tries to explain what the animal was, but the game froze as the Gromp ate them all before Molly could explain them, and the game couldn't process any of the creatures considering there weren't any left. Not really a full-fledged review, just some noteworthy issues. But weirdly enough, this was the second game to have froze on me. Hopefully this isn't a common thing. But in short, I'm pretty sure most people haven't heard of Hurdy-Gurdy. And the idea of moving animals around to progress a story isn't something very new, especially if you've played Pikmin, which is still the better game. But there is some charm to Hurdy-Gurdy, and somewhat worth checking out. For weirdness, I'll give it a 2, and obscurity, I'll give it a 5. Alright, halfway there. And it's time to move on to the next game, Metal Arms Glitch in the System. I'll be playing the Nintendo GameCube version for this one. The game was released in 2003 and developed by Swinging Ape Studios and Mass Media Games. Mass Media Games, however, only developed the PS2 version. And the publishers were Sierra Entertainment and Vivendi Games, who might be responsible for the multitude of bad Crash Bandicoot games, like Tag Team Racing. Weirdly enough, this was the only game made by Swinging Ape Studios. I'd go into more detail about their studio, but we got a game to talk about, as it's about the post-apocalyptic future, where robots are the only beings left on the planet, and they've basically made their own civilization, until a robot literally made an evil robot named General Corrosive, and he decided to take over the world, and you play an abandoned droid with amnesia named Glitch, who joins a robot rebellion. Considering the game is about robots and war, obviously you think of third-person shooters, similar to, well, Ratchet & Clank, which I'm pretty certain was the inspiration for the title, which is really ironic, and I'll explain why soon. As you are given a multitude of weapons switch between grenades, and the game also has an interesting multiplayer, but I didn't have anyone to play with, and you can also play it by yourself, which is also weird. Another really weird and pretty funny thing I really like about this game is that if you actually hit one of the enemy joints, they actually lose control of that part of their body. So if you shoot them in their gun shooting arm, their arm will literally just shake around while bullets are sent flying. It's really funny. Or you can shoot their entire arms off and they'll just be running away like cowards. But there are still a handful of people who know this game exists. But I really wouldn't call this game obscure, I'd call it overshadowed. That's mostly because 2003 had some really interesting titles that came out the same year, like ironically enough, the sequel to Ratchet & Clank Going Commando, Call of Duty, Jak 2, Beyond Good and Evil, and Tak and the Power of Juju. It's not the fact that Metal Arms was an obscure title to begin with, it was the fact that it was overshadowed by other bigger name games, especially considering some of those are big sequels and considered hidden gems nowadays. So both its weird and obscure rating will be a 3. You know what's actually really funny? This isn't the only game I'm going to be talking about that came out in the year 2003. And it's not the last one published by Eidos Interactive for me. I'll be talking about the PlayStation 2 game Whiplash, though the developer this time was actually Crystal Dynamics. Yes, that Crystal Dynamics. And oh boy, the plot in this one is definitely weird, as this time around you're not just one character, you're two characters. A long-tailed weasel named Spanx and a rabbit named Redmond, who find themselves chained to one another and find a way out of the product testing corporation known as Genron, not to get confused with Genion, who's run by the animal-hating CEO, Franklin D. Mann. As much as I want to talk about my opinions on the gameplay of this game, which is weird considering I tested it beforehand, I couldn't get the game to properly work now. This was me actually trying to record footage for this game.
Hey, this is just like water skiing, except it's on concrete. Hey, this is just like water skiing, except it's on concrete and flat on my back, and it's really painful.
Even though I tested previously, I somehow got soft-locked in the first area of the game. Though the footage I'll be using is from Ultimate Gaming Dude, who did an entire playthrough of this game. So go check him out. But from the footage and my own personal free time playing this game, it is a 3D platformer with a little bit of beat-em-up action, where you have to destroy everything, with Redmond being your tool of massive destruction. Did I also forget to mention the humor in this game is also really funny?
You know what? I'll even forgive you for eating my mother.
And I'll also address the elephant in the room. Spanx is also a playable character in the game Mad Dash Racing, but it's hard to tell which game is the spin-off, so I'll make an exception for this time around. Gameplay seems pretty simple, with funny humor, and if you find this game, I'd say give it a look for yourself, but until I can get my game to work, I'll give you my personal opinion on it like sometime on my Twitter. Both obscurity and weirdness, I'll give it a 4. And here we are at the last game of the video. And trust me when I say, I'm pretty sure no one has ever heard of this game. Probably the biggest reason why I wanted to make this video. Released also in 2003, we have Freaky Flyers, developed and published by Midway. I really like games by Midway, so yeah, this was actually something I really was surprised to find. And it's a racing game nonetheless. But not any type of racing game, it's a plane racer. Similar to the airplane racing in Diddy Kong Racing, the only difference being everyone has a gun. The plot for Freaky Flyers differs with each character, as the campaign mode depends on the character you choose. During I'm nearly 30, single, and do nothing but play video games and watch anime. Obviously I started off playing as Tracy Torpedoes. The racing in this game is extremely different from most titles I've played. Obviously you can accelerate, you could somehow brake in the air, don't know how that works. You have a Gatling gun, you have an item slot, and you can do flips, which are fairly useless unless you're playing specific minigames. I'll get to that later. But what makes the game really interesting is the racetracks, as each racetrack has a specific mission in order for you to find, which will lead to shortcuts or an extra item slot. And trust me, I say they're mandatory if you want to win the campaign, because the AI in this game is really brutal. Though the story mode for each character is structured the same. A few races, a side minigame, more races, another minigame, repeat twice until you face the endgame boss, Pilot X, who for some reason is always in a disguise. You could probably make an entire compilation of how he appears. In fact, you can probably make it a meme entirely. One of my biggest gripes in the game is the side missions. Trust me when I say the side missions, especially the Protect the Battleship mission, is one of the worst things about this game, as you have to destroy 20 battleships and make sure they don't destroy your only single battleship. This mission gets really tedious. I mean, the Pilot X boss fight is also not fun either, but at least eventually you can beat it. Also, is it me, or does the narrator for this game sound like Link Heartthrob from the Muppets?
Afterwards, why not check out some sights? With your Freaky Flyer ID card, you can get 10% off at all the city's tourist attractions, in some top-notch restaurants, and several crappy ones.
Freaky Flyers is the very definition of a weird, obscure one-off game. Though the GameCube version is actually considered the inferior version, which I didn't know until later research on the game, on account of it uses a 2-disc system, which probably makes it one of the hardest games to emulate for the GameCube. There's also versions for the original Xbox and the PlayStation 2, which weirdly enough have their own unique roster of characters. So if you wanted to actually beat this game to a true 100%, you'd have to buy all 3 versions and unlock every single character. But other than that, my final score for Freaky Flyers in weirdness and obscurity is both a full-fledged 5, the very definition of a weird and obscure one-off game. And that should probably do for now. If you know any other games that are weird, obscure one-offs, let me know in the comments, and maybe I'll do another video on this. Just make sure when you put the game in the comments, just make sure to look up the game to see whether or not it actually doesn't have a sequel or not. As I also wanted to put Elebits in Kid Kong Crazy Chase, but believe it or not, those games actually have sequels. Kid Clown itself is an actual series, and I do want to do a video about those games in the future too, so if you want to see those, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. And if you want to see all of my content, make sure to follow me on Twitter, check out my Twitch streams, which I'll be doing in March, and if you want to, you can also support the Patreon. But until then, see you next time!